Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I should have known something was off the moment I pulled into the driveway and saw my father's truck parked just slightly crooked, like he hadn't really been paying attention when he pulled in. It was a little thing, a barely noticeable detail, but in my family, the little things always spoke the loudest. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. I'd made the drive out here telling myself this would be just another stiff, polite dinner where I smiled through gritted teeth, complimented the under-seasoned chicken, and listened to my brother drone on about how hard it was raising two kids in the suburbs with Diane breathing down his neck about a new patio heater. I didn't expect warmth or welcome, but I thought I knew what I was walking into. I thought I'd already memorized the script. The house looked the same as it always did: trim hedges, too many decorative pillows in the living room, and a photo of Eric's family prominently displayed in every damn corner like it was a showroom for domestic mediocrity. I walked in carrying a bottle of Cabernet and a store-bought pie because God forbid I arrive empty-handed. My father greeted me with a distracted nod, already halfway through a beer, and Diane offered her usual brittle smile as she took the pie and immediately moved it to the other desserts table, which I knew meant she had already baked something she deemed more presentable. Dinner was predictably awkward: overcooked chicken breast, watery green beans, and conversations so bland it made the food taste interesting by comparison. Frank mostly asked Eric about work, how the firm was doing, whether the new car was handling well, how little Ryan was doing in baseball. I answered a few generic questions about my consulting work, deliberately vague, because I knew no one at the table actually cared what I did. They just wanted to confirm that I hadn't completely fallen apart and move on. I smiled politely, nodded in the right places, and waited for the evening to end so I could go home, take off my bra, and pour myself a Real drink. It was during dessert that everything shifted, subtly at first, then all at once. My father reached into his coat pocket, clearing his throat like he was about to make a toast, and held up two envelopes, one in each hand. His face was unreadable, eyes flicking between Eric and me, and for a second, I felt a flicker of surprise. Maybe, just maybe, he was about to do something fair. Maybe he had actually thought about balance, about recognition, about the difference between showing love and just handing out obligations. He handed one envelope directly to Eric without hesitation. "There you go," he said, tone casual, almost dismissive. "He needs it more. He has a family to support." I blinked, not fully registering the words at first, as if they'd passed through me without meaning. Then it hit me, the weight behind them, the familiarity of that phrase, the same old justification wrapped in a new excuse. He needs it more. Because he has a family. Because he's a father. Because Diane stays home and the kids need a bigger yard and a new fridge, and every single financial decision he ever made somehow becomes a collective responsibility that the rest of us are just supposed to accept without question. There was no second envelope. There was no check for me. There wasn't even a word of acknowledgement, not a thank you, not a single breath spent considering what I might have done with that inheritance money, or, more importantly, what I might have needed it for. Eric grinned, smug as hell, like he had just won a game I didn't even know we were playing. Diane immediately leaned over and took the envelope from his hands, flipping it open without shame, eyes scanning the check like it was a birthright. She didn't even try to hide it. I just stared at my father, not speaking, not reacting, not giving him the satisfaction of an outburst. I saw the flicker of discomfort in his eyes when he finally met my gaze, a small shadow of guilt that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He said nothing else. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He simply went back to sipping his beer as if the moment was done, settled, nothing more to say. That's when I realized something sharp and final had settled in my chest, not just the usual sting of being overlooked, but something colder, something harder, something that told me this wasn't just another dinner, wasn't just another moment to swallow in silence and pretend I was fine. I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the manila envelope I had carried with me for over a week, unsure if I would ever find the right moment to use it. Inside it were legal documents, notarized and final, a full trust revision I'd worked on with my attorney after months of careful planning. I hadn't told anyone, not even my closest friends, what I had done. It wasn't meant as a weapon. It had been an act of quiet love, of gratitude, a legacy I wanted to leave for the man I once believed had done his best. Funny, I said, my voice calm and clear, slicing through the smugness like a blade through butter. I was going to pay off your mortgage. And that was the moment the air in the room changed. There's a kind of exhaustion that builds slowly over years, like sediment collecting layer by layer in the back of your ribs, the kind that doesn't scream, but sits quietly beneath every moment, every interaction. Every small injustice you're expected to swallow in the name of keeping peace or being the bigger person. I sat there at the dinner table, my fingers still loosely curled around the edge of my chair, the air thick with the sound of forks scraping plates and fake pleasantries limping forward after the blow I'd just delivered. But under it all, beneath the silence, beneath my calm exterior, there was a storm I'd carried for years, a storm I'd never been allowed to let out loud. Because I was always the one who didn't need anything, right? I was the independent one, the reliable one, the one who didn't make a fuss, didn't beg for help, didn't spiral into chaos or cry at the dinner table. I was the one who figured things out on my own, kept a roof over her head without asking for loans, kept her emotions tidy and her disappointments quieter than everyone else's needs. That was my role in the family dynamic, silent resilience masquerading as strength. Growing up, it was always Eric who got the new bike first, who got the better room, who got out of chores because he had football, while I quietly finished the dishes and folded towels behind closed doors. I used to tell myself it didn't matter, that I didn't want the spotlight anyway, that I preferred staying behind the curtain. But over time, the message buried underneath all those small preferences became deafeningly clear. His needs were louder, more important, more urgent. Mine were manageable, therefore forgettable. When I got my first job out of college, I didn't get a celebratory dinner or a new suit or a handshake from Dad in the garage like Eric got when he landed a junior sales role through one of Frank's old buddies. I just got a "that's nice, Claire," and a reminder to put something away for retirement early. I've carried that memory with me longer than I care to admit. And when I paid off my student loans by 30, no one said a damn thing, but when Eric refinanced his mortgage for the third time, the whole family gathered around like he'd just won a Nobel Prize in economics. Frank always had a way of justifying it, always with the same tired line delivered like a moral compass. Eric struggling, Claire. You're doing fine. As if doing fine was some permanent condition, as if it meant I had no needs, no emotions, no right to ever feel left out or betrayed. And over time, I started to believe it too, swallowing down my own disappointments with a straight back and a polite smile, thinking maybe it was noble to carry the weight quietly, to be proud of not needing anything from anyone. But that night, that night, I felt every one of those swallowed years hit me at once. I looked at my father, not with anger, not even with disappointment anymore, but with a kind of tired clarity. He hadn't changed. He was still doing what he'd always done, tending to the loudest fire and assuming the rest would burn just fine on its own. And the worst part wasn't the check, wasn't even the public dismissal. The worst part was that I'd honestly believed, even for a second, that this time might be different. Have you ever been told to just understand while watching someone else take everything you earned, just because they were louder about needing it? Ever had your strength used as an excuse to ignore your worth? Let me know in the comments. I can't be the only one who's felt invisible just because I wasn't crying for help. Diane shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable now, but that didn't stop her from lobbing her own version of a guilt trip. Her voice dipped in that same faux compassion she always used when she wanted to sound polite while cutting someone down. Claire, she said, tilting her head like she was delivering some great truth, that's not fair. You don't have kids. It landed like a slap. Not because it was true, but because it was said so casually, like it somehow justified everything, like motherhood was a currency that automatically outweighed every other responsibility, sacrifice, or achievement in life. I stared at her for a long second, fighting the urge to laugh, Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it all had reached a new level of ridiculous. I wanted to ask her if she thought my life only mattered in comparison to how many mouths I fed, if she believed that not having children made me less deserving of respect, of money, of legacy. But I didn't say anything, not yet. I just sat there, the storm in my chest building a little higher, a little sharper, and thought, no, Diane, I don't have kids. But that doesn't mean I don't have worth. And you better believe I was about to prove it. The weight of Diane's words still hung in the air like a heavy fog that refused to lift, thick with implication, as if everything I had done in my life was somehow rendered insignificant because I hadn't added a couple of children to a holiday card. I didn't flinch, not even as my father cleared his throat again, awkwardly, almost defensively, like he was preparing to reinforce her point without realizing he was already standing on fractured ground. I sat still, breathing slowly through my nose, measuring the moment, letting their assumptions echo through the room before I decided whether to shatter them completely or let them simmer a little longer. I'd carried that manila envelope in my purse for over a week, unsure if I'd ever have the courage or the reason to open it in front of them. I had told myself a dozen times that it was unnecessary, that I wasn't the kind of person who needed to prove her worth through paperwork or financial gestures. But now, sitting here, seeing the casual dismissal in Diane's eyes, the indifferent shrug from Eric, and the hollow rationalizations from my father, I realized that sometimes silence isn't strength, it's just ammunition you haven't decided how to use yet. So I reached into my bag again, calm and methodical, fingers closing around the familiar edge of the envelope that still bore my attorney's initials in the top corner. I slid it out without a word and laid it gently on the table, right beside my untouched wine glass. The sound of the paper hitting the wood wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to pull everyone's attention away from their self-righteous posturing. This, I said, tapping my index finger against the envelope slowly, was supposed to be a surprise. I watched Diane's face shift from smugness to something more cautious, her eyes narrowing slightly, her smile slipping at the edges as if she sensed the shift in power but didn't yet understand what it meant. Frank leaned forward slightly, brows furrowed, and Eric tilted his head, confused but uninterested enough not to care yet. I've been working with my attorney for the last 6 months, I continued, my voice smooth, but laced with a chill that hadn't been there before, to arrange the payoff of your mortgage. Full amount. No refinancing. No strings. Just done. Frank blinked, clearly not processing what I'd said. Diane went still, her hand frozen in mid-reach for her fork, and Eric finally stopped pretending he wasn't listening. I was going to transfer the funds through a trust, I added, sliding the envelope closer to my father, so it would be protected and managed properly. You wouldn't have had to lift a finger. You wouldn't have owed a dime. I'd already signed the paperwork. The silence that followed was unlike the one from earlier. It wasn't born of confusion or awkward tension. It was heavy with disbelief, with realization, with the bitter taste of guilt that only hits when you know you've just played the fool without even realizing there was a game being played. Diane was the first to speak, though her voice barely registered above a whisper. You were going to... what? I met her eyes squarely, no malice, no bravado, just cold truth. I thought it mattered. I thought taking care of this house mattered. I thought showing gratitude, in a way that actually counted, mattered. Frank looked down at the envelope like it was a bomb he didn't know how to defuse. He opened it slowly, fingers trembling slightly as he pulled out the documents, copies of bank drafts, property assessments, legal language outlining the terms of the trust. His mouth moved slightly, but no words came. For the first time that night, he was completely silent, truly silenced, not by insult, not by defiance, but by the weight of what he hadn't seen coming. I didn't ask for anything, I said quietly. I didn't ask for a check or an acknowledgement. I didn't even tell anyone I was doing this, because I honestly believed it was the right thing to do. But apparently, being the one who never asks for help just means you get to watch everyone else take everything. Eric finally snapped out of his daze, pushing his chair back slightly, his voice uneven now, tinged with something between disbelief and indignation. Wait, so you were going to give them the money? The way he said it, like it was some kind of betrayal, like the idea of me doing something generous for our father was a personal attack on his entitlement, made something in my chest go cold. I looked at him and saw not a brother, not family, but a man who had spent his entire life believing that anything given to someone else was something stolen from him. And in that moment, I realized something even uglier than what had just happened at this table. He wasn't shocked that I had tried to help. He was angry that I had done it without centering him in the process. And trust me, I wasn't done yet. The ride home felt longer than it should have, the road stretching ahead of me like some cruel metaphor for how far I'd traveled without anyone noticing. The streetlights blurred through the windshield, the hum of the engine filling the silence that settled like dust on my shoulders, heavy and familiar. I didn't turn the radio on. I didn't want the noise. I just needed the quiet, the raw, unforgiving quiet that had become my only real companion on nights like this. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe you but strips you bare, leaves you staring at every memory you've buried under layers of polite smiles and silent sacrifices. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But I could feel the weight of it rising in my chest again, that slow, churning heat that had nothing to do with disappointment and everything to do with something deeper, something bitter and cold and sharp. Rage. Not loud, fiery rage, but the quiet, relentless kind that builds over years, brick by brick, moment by moment, until it becomes a goddamn foundation beneath everything you do. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes, engine idling, hands still gripping the steering wheel like I was bracing for impact. But the impact had already happened, hadn't it? It had been happening for years. I just hadn't wanted to admit how much damage it had done. Inside my house, everything was still in its place. The shoes neatly lined by the door. The coat hanging exactly where I'd left it. The framed photo of Mom on the hallway table, smiling softly like she always did, like she somehow knew everything and said nothing. I stood in front of that photo longer than usual, staring at her eyes, trying to find some kind of answer in the silence between us. The flashbacks hit fast and hard, those final months in the hospice, when she was already slipping away and no one else seemed to have time to visit regularly. I remembered sitting beside her bed, holding her hand through the quiet hours while Frank shuffled between hospital invoices and TV reruns, and Eric sent quick texts saying he'd try to stop by later this week if he wasn't swamped. He was always swamped. Diane was overwhelmed with the kids. The burden fell to me, naturally, as it always had. No one asked if I was okay. No one wondered how I was holding up. I just did what needed to be done, because that's who I was, the reliable one, the sturdy one, the one who didn't crumble when the air got heavy and grief seeped into the walls. And it didn't stop after Mom was gone. When the bills piled up and the paperwork flooded in, when Frank couldn't figure out how to handle the estate or even how to pay the utility bills, it was me who stepped in. It was me who sat with him at the bank, me who dealt with the lawyer, me who sorted through 30 years of documents and chaos while Eric was busy planning a family vacation in Florida. I thought back to that winter when the pipes in Dad's basement burst during the cold snap. Eric was off at some golf retreat with his buddies, and Diane claimed she couldn't find a plumber who'd come on short notice. I canceled my own plans, took 3 days off from work, and handled the entire mess myself, wading through water, calling in favors, staying up until 2 in the morning drying out furniture and salvaging paperwork soaked in mildew. Not one thank you. Not one acknowledgement. No one ever remembered it happened. And maybe that was the most infuriating part, the invisibility of it all. Not the work itself, but the way it evaporated in their memories the moment it was done. The way it didn't register in their calculations of who deserved what, who carried weight, who mattered when it came time to distribute more than just money. I had spent years quietly cleaning up behind them, patching cracks they didn't even notice, holding the line while they took their comfort for granted. And tonight, they'd made it crystal clear. They didn't just forget, they never saw it to begin with. I poured a glass of wine, sat on the edge of the couch, and stared out at the quiet street. Something shifted inside me, something that had been lingering under the surface for a long time, but had never quite risen to the light. It wasn't just rage anymore. It was clarity. Pure, sharp-edged clarity. The kind that doesn't leave room for guilt or second chances. The kind that doesn't soften. I picked up my phone without hesitation, scrolled to my lawyer's number, and hit call. When he answered, I didn't bother with small talk. I didn't even sit down. "Let's go forward with the revision," I said, my voice steady, calm, final. And just like that, something inside me finally clicked into place. The decision, when it finally settled into place inside me, felt less like a sudden strike of vengeance and more like a calm unraveling of something that had been knotted tight for far too long. There was no gloating, no cinematic sense of triumph, no grand explosion of emotion that marked the moment I chose to sever myself from the decades of unequal expectations and thankless loyalty. Instead, it felt like slowly loosening a rope around my own throat and realizing I'd been holding the ends in my own hands the entire time. When I said the words to my lawyer, "Let's go forward with the revision," it wasn't rage speaking anymore. It was reason, steady and unflinching, born not from spite, but from the undeniable truth that sometimes the only way to be free is to stop pretending you still owe the people who never valued what you gave. We met that following Monday in his office, tucked inside a weathered brick building with crooked blinds and the scent of old books in the air. I sat across from him as he read through the preliminary drafts, his brow occasionally lifting in surprise, though he never questioned my choices. He knew better than to mistake my calmness for hesitation. I made it clear from the start, there would be no inheritance for my father. Nothing left to be divided between those who only ever counted me when they needed something, who saw my stability not as the result of effort, but as permission to take without asking. Instead, every asset, every account, every property was to be redirected into two foundations established in my mother's name, one for women re-entering the workforce after loss or divorce, and another for terminal care support programs in low-income communities, the kind of work she used to volunteer for back before cancer began quietly erasing her from this world. She deserved to be remembered in more than faded photos and dusty sympathy cards. She deserved a legacy, not a forgotten line in someone else's obituary. But I didn't stop there. I had my lawyer add a specific clause, airtight, ironclad, legally binding, that would ensure Eric could never access a cent. Not indirectly, not through his children, not even if he filed a claim of financial hardship or begged for a loophole. I didn't want him fighting for what he never earned, and I sure as hell didn't want Diane whispering in his ear about how to manipulate the system once I was gone. I even had language inserted to block Diane from serving as guardian or proxy on any potential funds that might benefit community programs. I made sure my legacy would never touch their hands. A week later, I visited my father one last time. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the sky looks like it's holding in rain but never follows through. I brought him a coffee, black, no sugar, just like he liked it, and handed it to him without ceremony. He seemed surprised by my visit, but not unpleasantly so, more curious than anything, like he couldn't quite tell if he was being forgiven or if I was simply making one last attempt at being the dutiful daughter he never realized he'd already lost. We talked for a few minutes about nothing. The weather, traffic, some local contractor he was thinking about hiring to fix the back fence. I nodded along, made small talk, kept my voice warm but distant, the way you speak to someone you used to love before they made you see them clearly. He asked how work was going, and I gave him the same vague answer I always did. He didn't notice the difference. He never had. Before I left, I excused myself to the back room, my old room, technically, though it had long since been stripped of anything that resembled me. I placed the final, signed copy of the will in the top drawer of the desk by the window, under a stack of old magazines I knew he wouldn't touch for months. No note. No explanation. Just ink and paper and everything they never saw coming. I walked out of the house without looking back, the wind catching my coat as I stepped down the porch stairs, and I felt something strange and unfamiliar settle inside my chest. Peace, not victory. Peace that didn't need recognition, didn't need applause, didn't even need to be understood. Later that week, I got a call I let go to voicemail. Then another. And another. It wasn't until Sunday afternoon that my phone finally stopped buzzing, only to light up with a message from Nora, short and breathless. Barely 3 words. Diane found it. I didn't reply, but I could picture it perfectly, her standing in that room, papers in hand, mouth hanging open, voice climbing into that shrill, panicked pitch she always used when something wasn't going according to plan. Claire did what, she must have said, loud enough for the whole damn neighborhood to hear. And that was the moment I knew it had landed. Not revenge. Resolution. The silence that followed the discovery of the will wasn't the kind that comes with resolution or reconciliation. It was the kind that fills a space when people realize the story they've been telling themselves no longer matches the truth sitting in front of them. It wasn't explosive, not dramatic or theatrical, not filled with screaming or slamming doors. No, it was quieter than that, but heavier too, thick, like fog that rolls in and settles over everything, refusing to be ignored, wrapping around each conversation like a question no one wants to ask out loud. For days afterward, the phone started ringing more often, and every time I saw Eric's name flash across the screen, I let it go unanswered. Not because I was avoiding him, not because I needed time to cool off or gather myself, but because I had finally run out of reasons to pretend his voice still mattered in my life. He called once in the morning, then again late at night, the pattern repeating like clockwork, as if his persistence alone might somehow unravel what had already been done, might somehow rewind the clock to a time when I still felt obligated to explain myself. I didn't even listen to the voicemails at first, not until the third one, when his tone shifted from confusion to guilt to that familiar defensiveness he always pulled out when his comfort was threatened. "Claire, come on," he said, voice low and strained. "We didn't know you felt that way. You could have just said something." And there it was again, the way they always placed the burden of clarity on me, the way they turned their own blindness into my responsibility, as if it was somehow my fault for not shouting louder, not begging harder, not tearing myself open wide enough to make my pain palatable for them. Then came my father's voice, weary and subdued in a way I hadn't heard since the days after Mom died, when grief had finally softened him enough to sound almost human. "We didn't mean to hurt you," he said in the voicemail, pausing between words like he didn't quite know how to arrange them. "I thought I was doing what was best. I didn't think it would. I didn't realize." But the truth is, he had realized, just not in time, and not in a way that ever changed anything. He didn't mean to hurt me, but that's the most dangerous kind of hurt, isn't it? The kind that hides behind good intentions, the kind that wears the mask of love while slowly carving into your sense of worth. I didn't respond. I didn't call back. I didn't send a message or write a carefully worded letter explaining my choices. I just sat at my desk, watching the morning light slide across the hardwood floor, letting the silence do what it needed to do. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't reveling in what they now knew or what they could never undo. I was just finished trying to prove my value in a room full of people who had decided long ago that my silence meant I was content, that my independence meant I didn't need anything, that my strength was some kind of disqualifier for compassion. The final message came from Diane, of course, and I knew it would. Her words came in sharp, clipped text, the kind you send when you're trying to hold on to control, but your grip is already slipping. "You'll regret this," she wrote, followed by, "You broke this family." I read it once, slowly, then again just to let it sink in, and then I deleted it without a second thought. Because I didn't break this family. I just stopped pretending it was whole in the first place. There's a strange kind of peace that comes when you finally choose yourself without apology, when you stop waiting for people to acknowledge the weight you've carried and simply set it down, whether they notice or not. It doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't feel like revenge. It just feels like air finally reaching your lungs after years of shallow breaths. I sat there for a long while, staring out the window at the trees shifting in the breeze, letting that peace settle in piece by piece, like something earned instead of inherited. And maybe that's what it all came down to in the end. What we earn versus what we're handed, what we carry quietly while others shout their struggles into every room. What we learn about love and fairness and obligation when the people closest to us show us how little they think we need to be seen. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's not fireworks or final speeches or dramatic exits. Sometimes it's just not showing up anymore. Not answering the phone. Not explaining your side. Not asking for permission to protect your own peace. So tell me, what would you have done?